They found the baby's rattle buried 6 inches deep beneath the rosemary bed, still clean, still shining, but there were no children left in New Eden. Not anymore. The rooms were silent. Beds neatly made, plates still on the tables, chairs still pulled out, like the families had simply stepped outside and vanished into the wind. But you and I both know, families don't vanish. Not without reason, not without help, not without something darker moving behind the curtains. This is the story they buried, a story so tightly sealed, so violently scrubbed from history, that even now, saying it aloud feels like opening a grave, because New Eden wasn't built for God, it was built for control. It was engineered, designed, a carefully constructed theater of faith, where the show never ended, and the exits were locked. You've heard whispers of it, maybe in passing, a sentence in a newspaper from the 1800s, a half-page in a banned book, or the kind of story an old man tells once before falling silent forever. But now, you're going to hear it all. The truth they killed to keep hidden, the prophet, the house, the rituals after dark, the disappearances, the money, the bodies, and the system so well-oiled, so precise, that entire families disappeared, and not a single neighbor raised a hand. This isn't just about what happened in Kansas, it's about what's still happening, because New Eden was never just a place. It was a blueprint, and once you understand that, you'll never see your own community the same again. Now listen carefully. The first family to vanish was the Millers, 7 souls gone in one night, and nobody asked why, because by then, as you'll soon see, the asking itself had become a sin. Herman Miller didn't trust prophets, not really. But his wife had begged him to visit New Eden just for 1 week. She had read the pamphlet, heard the testimonies, seen the sketches of fertile land, clean houses, happy children. And Herman, a man who had buried 2 daughters in the last winter freeze, was too tired to fight anymore, so they came, with their 4 surviving children and what little savings they had left, 2 mules, 3 crates of supplies, a wedding ring, and a letter from a dying brother he never got to answer. The road into New Eden wound through a shallow valley, lined with white stones, and scripture carved into wooden posts every 20 feet. "You are not entering land." The first one read, "You are entering obedience." The second said, "The world out there wants your body, but God wants your soul." The third, "He who questions the shepherd will be fed to the wolves." By the time they reached the gate, Herman knew something was wrong, but his wife was smiling, his children were laughing, and a tall man with grey hair and eyes like frozen lakes was waiting for them with arms wide open. "Welcome," he said. "You are safe now." They called him Prophet Isaiah, and that night he dined with them personally, speaking of heaven, of struggle, of a divine simplicity that required sacrifice. "Everything for God," he said. "Everything." Herman nodded, but his hands clenched beneath the table. He had survived war, famine, loss, and the slow death of a dream. But nothing had prepared him for this place. Nothing had prepared him for the sound of the bells at midnight, or the way every building had no locks, but every door could only be opened from the outside. Nothing prepared him for what he saw in the chapel basement on the 3rd night, or the silence that followed when he tried to speak of it. New Eden did not punish disobedience immediately. It allowed it to fester, to bloom in private, so that when judgment came, it felt inevitable. And by the time Herman Miller realized he was no longer free to leave, he was already part of the offering, the first of 9, and what happened to him became the template, the method, the ritual. One man, one moment, that would set the course for everything that followed. They said Herman left for a mission trip, in the middle of winter, with no coat, no horse, no goodbye. They said God had spoken to him, given him a vision, a call to travel east and spread the doctrine of divine simplicity, and the others believed it. At least on the surface, they nodded in the great hall, bowed their heads in prayer, repeated the same phrases in unison. But a few of them looked at Sarah Richardson and noticed how still she sat, how her eyes never left the door, as if daring anyone to doubt the story, but no one did, not out loud, because by then something had changed in New Eden. There were no more letters being sent out. The post was managed only by Elder Sarah, and only one wagon ever left the gates. Drawn by Joshua, its contents always covered, its destination never disclosed. No one questioned it. Not after Herman, but Herman's wife knew. Her name was Lydia, and for 3 nights after her husband disappeared, she sat in silence by the cold stove, holding a single boot that had belonged to him. She didn't eat, she didn't sleep. She just stared through the wall, as if listening to something she could not explain. And then, on the 4th night, she broke. She stood in the middle of evening prayers, sobbing, screaming that her husband was not on any mission, that the prophet was a liar, that they had taken him, buried him, used him, and the room froze. Isaiah didn't stand, he didn't shout, he simply raised one hand and pointed to the door. Joshua stepped forward, 2 other men followed. Lydia was removed. Not violently, not loudly, just efficiently, as if it had happened before, as if it was part of the liturgy. The next morning, the Miller children were gone too, their bunks stripped, their names erased from the community ledger, their clothes burned, their shoes tossed into the fire pit behind the dining hall, and when the next family arrived a week later, they were given the Miller's cabin. Fully furnished, immaculate, unhaunted, and no one ever spoke their names again. In New Eden, memory was treason, and silence was survival. It wasn't just the disappearances that made New Eden dangerous. It was how quickly people learned to look away. Because silence here wasn't weakness. It was currency, it was survival, and it was the only way to keep your children from becoming the next sermon. Every Sunday, in the great hall beneath the stained glass, Isaiah would preach of obedience, not love, not grace, not mercy, obedience. He spoke of Abraham, of Isaac, of men who gave everything to God and asked for nothing in return. He spoke of fire, of judgment, of voices that came in the night demanding sacrifice. And when he looked at the children, they looked away, because they had heard the screams too. They had seen the prophet's house at midnight, the candlelight in the upstairs window, the red stains on Joshua's sleeves in the morning, always explained away as butchering hogs, even though there were no hogs in the pen, and no meat ever served at breakfast. Elder Sarah said they were fasting, spiritual cleansing, a call to simplicity. But the children knew. They knew which bunk would be empty the next day. They knew which mother would stop singing at supper, which father would suddenly begin to pray, too loudly, too publicly, as if trying to cover something. That's how fear works, not as thunder, but as stillness. New Eden didn't rule with chains. It ruled with shame. Isaiah taught that to doubt him was to doubt God, and to doubt God was death, not just in this world, but in the next. He would speak of eternal fire, of eyes that watched from beyond, of angels with black wings who whispered the names of the disobedient into the prophet's ear while he slept. He told them that if anyone left the community, their names would be erased from the book of life, and worse, from memory, that their children would wander the world unnamed, that their souls would never find peace. And then he would smile, a thin, cold, reptilian smile, and say, "But for those who obey, for those who stay loyal, heaven will not wait. It will come here, to New Eden," and the hall would echo with amens, murmured like confessions, not of faith, but of fear, because by then they weren't praying to God anymore. They were praying to be spared. The town nearest to New Eden was 50 miles away, and no one from that town had been inside the gates in nearly 6 years. Not the mailman, not the sheriff, not even the census taker, because Prophet Isaiah made it clear the outside world was diseased, filled with greed, lust, doubt, and worst of all, curiosity. Curiosity was the real enemy. He said, it killed Eve, it killed Lot's wife, and it would kill them too, if they ever looked back. So the gates were closed, the telegraph wires were cut, and the only information allowed in or out was what Isaiah approved. New Eden was not just a settlement anymore, it was a sealed world. Time didn't move the same inside those fences. Seasons passed, babies were born, elders died quietly, buried beneath headstones with no names, only scripture. The children were taught one history, that America was Babylon, that the rest of the world had fallen into darkness, and only New Eden remained as a beacon of light. They were shown maps that ended at the valley, told that other towns had burned, that no trains ran anymore, that outsiders would kill them if they left. And after enough years, it didn't matter if it was true, because truth had been replaced with repetition. Isaiah understood what modern institutions now perfect. You don't need fences. If you can build fear, you don't need guards. If you can build belief, and in New Eden, belief was the only air they breathed. Once a month, Isaiah held what he called the cleansing. Everyone gathered in the chapel, candles lit, children silent, eyes wide. He would read names from a scroll. Sometimes no one reacted. Sometimes a mother sobbed. Sometimes a man stood up and simply walked to the front, as if he had known all along. They were led away by Joshua, never violently, never screamed, just led, quietly. And then the scroll was burned, and the ash scattered in the garden, where roses grew redder than blood, and the children, the children were told, "These people have become part of the foundation. Their sacrifice will feed the soil of paradise." And they believed it, because what choice did they have, when the only thing worse than being taken was being the next one to ask why? 3 days after the cleansing, the entire community gathered in the garden. The air was thick with incense, the sky overcast, and the children were handed white lilies, one for each soul who had been taken, they called it, the planting. Elder Sarah wore a blue shawl stitched with stars, her voice low, measured, as she read from what she claimed was the Book of Remembrance. It had no cover, no publisher, only handwritten pages in crimson ink. She would say each name, even though the names weren't real, not anymore. Then she would point to a small hole in the ground, and a child would step forward, kneel, and place a lily inside. No tears, no questions, only ritual. And every time, when the last flower was planted, Prophet Isaiah would step forward, raise both hands to the sky, and speak the same phrase, "From blood we build Eden." The community would repeat it, voices trembling, "From blood we build Eden," and then the singing would begin. Not hymns, not psalms, but strange circular songs, with no beginning, no end, like echoes from a dream you can't fully remember. Some said it was beautiful, some said it was divine. But one man, a former violinist from Ohio, who had joined the community in 1876, he said something else. He said the melody had no soul, that it felt like something was using their voices, speaking through them, feeding on them. He whispered this to his wife one night, then buried his violin beneath their cabin, and 2 weeks later he vanished too. The planting ceremony continued, month after month, season after season. And slowly the garden grew, but it was never the same twice. Some plants bloomed too early, some bled red sap when cut, some grew thorns that curved inward, like hooks, and still no one left, because by that point, leaving didn't just mean disobedience. It meant unmaking yourself. To leave meant you had to believe that everything you had done, everything you had given, everything you had watched happen in silence, was wrong. And for most, that was too much. It was easier to kneel in the garden, to plant the flowers, to chant the words and pray that when your turn came, you would be called gently. It was called the Room of Reckoning. No one spoke of it openly, but every adult knew where it was, and every child had heard the stories whispered under blankets. When they thought no one else was listening, it was beneath the prophet's house, down a narrow wooden staircase, lit only by oil lamps that never flickered, no matter how long they burned. No one was taken there without cause, or so they were told. But in New Eden, cause could mean anything. A lost tool, a broken dish, a sideways glance during prayer, and sometimes no cause at all, just the silent nod of Elder Sarah, or a name written on a folded scrap of paper, placed into the prophet's hand after supper. The room of reckoning wasn't for punishment, it was for purification. That's what Isaiah said. That's what they all repeated. He would bring the chosen one down himself, speak in low tones, place a hand on their shoulder, and guide them like a father guiding a lost son. And then the door would close. No one knew what happened inside. Not exactly. But when they returned, if they returned, they were never the same. One woman came back with a stitched mouth, told it was a lesson in silence. Another returned blind. The community told the children it was a miracle that her eyes had been burned by a vision of angels. And still they stayed, because to be chosen was to be noticed, and to be noticed meant you were seen by God. That's how Isaiah framed it. That's how the control worked. They called it voluntary confession, but it was neither voluntary nor confession. It was surrender. Each person who entered the room left more empty, more obedient, because in that room, the prophet learned your fears, your secrets, the faces you missed, the sins you carried, and he turned those things into chains. He would call you by your father's name, describe your childhood bedroom, recite the contents of a letter you burned a decade ago. Things no one should. To know, and then he would smile and tell you God knows you too, and if God knows you, he owns you, and if he owns you, so does New Eden. The children didn't play in New Eden. They recited, they obeyed, they fasted. Joy was not encouraged, laughter was not holy. Even birthdays were forbidden, because time belonged to God, and no one else. From the age of 5, they were given numbers, not names. Names were considered worldly, temporary, but numbers were eternal. Numbers were order. Each child wore a linen robe and a leather tag, branded with the number assigned to them by the Council of Elders. They didn't call them classrooms, they called them chambers. Each morning, the children lined up outside the schoolhouse in silence. No talking, no looking around. And when the bell rang, they filed inside one by one, past a mural of flames, angels, and a phrase carved in blood-red paint. Purity is obedience. Their lessons were not reading, not math, not history. They were taught the litany, verses of submission, phrases designed to erase identity and replace it with function. I am not mine, I am God's. I do not speak until spoken to. I do not look back. I do not ask why. I do not want. They repeated it 100 times each day, until it sank beneath their skin, until they spoke it in their sleep. Each week, they were tested, not with questions, but with temptations. A piece of candy placed on a desk, a picture of the outside world shown for just 1 second, a whisper from another child daring them to speak, and if they failed, they were marked. A black line on their robe, a silent meal alone. Sometimes, a visit from Joshua. He never hurt them, not in ways you could see, but the children who were taken aside always returned quieter, stiffer, eyes fixed on the floor. One little girl, number 21, began to pull out her hair, one strand at a time, each morning before class. When asked why, she only said, "I'm trying to make space." No one asked what she meant, because even among the children, silence was sacred and questions were sin. And what the rich, artisans feared most, what they worked hardest to kill, was imagination, because imagination is the beginning of rebellion. They didn't use coffins in New Eden, they called them vessels, simple wooden boxes, hand-built by the same hands that dug the earth, and each one was painted white, not to honor the dead, but to erase them. White meant purity, white meant finality, white meant you no longer belonged to the world, or even to your family. You belonged to the foundation. There were no gravestones, no names, just a circle of stones placed above the burial site, surrounding the vessel like a seal. They called it the Ring of Completion, and the ritual was always the same. At dawn, the community would gather in the east field, hoods raised, voices silent. Elder Sarah would kneel first, then the rest would follow. Until the prophet arrived. He never walked. He was carried. 4 boys, always the same, always trembling. Isaiah would descend from his platform, touch the vessel with both hands, and whisper something no one could hear. Then he would turn to the crowd and say, "They are no longer beneath us. They are within us." And the people would repeat, "Within us, within us, within us." It didn't matter how someone died, illness, accident, rumors of suicide. The cause was always rewritten. They were chosen, they were lifted, they were reclaimed. The living were never allowed to dig the graves, only those already marked, those who had failed a test or broken a vow. Digging was a form of penance, and penance was the only path to mercy. One former member, years after escaping, described the experience in a single sentence. It felt like I was burying a part of myself each time. And maybe that was the point. The more you bury, the more empty you become. And the more empty you become, the more the prophet can fill. One boy, number 13, was made to dig 3 graves before his 12th birthday. By 14, he stopped speaking entirely. By 16, he was gone. Some said he ran, some said he was reclaimed. But one morning, the east field had a knee. A ring of stones, and no one asked who was inside, because in New Eden you don't grieve the dead, you absorb them. You become the vessel. They called it the Covenant of Thorns. It happened only once in a person's life, but once was enough. No one spoke of it afterward, not even in whispers. Because what was said during the ritual could never be repeated. To break the vow was to unseal the curse. That's how Isaiah explained it, and so they obeyed. Every initiate at the age of 17 was taken beneath the meeting hall into the red chamber. It was circular, windowless, carved from clay. The walls painted with a spiral of script, a language no one outside New Eden could read. At the center of the chamber, a black table, a crown, and a knife. The crown was made of woven thorns, real ones, sharpened weekly by the elders. The knife was never used on others, only on the initiate. First, you spoke the oath of erasure. I renounce my former name. I release my former self. I forget the world and become the will. Then you placed the crown on your head. Some screamed, some wept, some passed out before the final cut, because the thorns weren't symbolic. They were precise, positioned to pierce the temples, to draw just enough blood to leave a scar. Then came the knife, not across the throat, not across the wrists, but the palm. Because the hand sins, the hand touches, the hand builds, and the hand must pay. Isaiah would watch, silently, as each initiate pressed the blade against their own flesh and carved the mark, an X, across the center of the palm, forever visible, forever burning. Then he would speak. Now you are new, now you are Eden, now you are mine. And the chamber would erupt in chant, low, rhythmic, dozens of voices saying one phrase over and over. We are the body, we are the body, we are the body. And from that moment forward, there was no escape. You were no longer a person. You were a vessel. You were a weapon. You were a shadow in the prophet's eye. Even if you ran, even if you screamed, even if you told the world what happened, you were still. First we thought as... Because the Covenant of Thorns wasn't just a ritual, it was a spell. And once spoken, it never lets go. It wasn't just fear that kept people silent, it was something else, something deeper, something unnatural they called it, the quieting. Every member of New Eden knew the word, but no one ever explained it. Not directly, not aloud. You learned by watching, by surviving. It started as a feeling, right behind your eyes, a kind of pressure, like something was watching you from inside your own skull. Then the sound around you would fade. Birdsong, wind, even the breath of those near you. Gone, not replaced by silence, but by something worse. Stillness. You'd try to speak, but your mouth wouldn't open. You'd try to run, but your legs would lock. And in that moment, you'd feel it. The presence, not the prophet, not the elders, something older, something buried. Isaiah claimed it was the voice of purity, cleansing your thoughts, washing you of doubt. But survivors told a different story. One girl, after escaping, said she still couldn't sleep with the lights off because the quieting came in darkness. Another man, 30 years later, still flinched when the wind stopped blowing. He said, "When everything goes still, I know it's listening," because that was the truth. The quieting wasn't random. It was punishment. If you doubted, if you hesitated, if you even thought of leaving, it would find you. And not just you, your wife, your son, your neighbor. Anyone near you when the quieting came would feel it too. And in New Eden, that meant guilt was contagious. You could be condemned by standing too close to someone who secretly wanted to flee. So the people learned not just to obey, but to distrust, to report, to confess, to preempt betrayal by becoming the betrayer. And that's how Isaiah kept them. Not through faith, but through fear, wrapped in ritual, through silence, wrapped in power, through a God no one saw but everyone heard. Only once. One woman broke the quieting. She screamed so loud, so long that the kirkyard. Birds fled the trees, and the prophet said, "That's how we knew she wasn't one of us." The next day she was gone, and the field where she stood never grew flowers again. The children were taught to forget, not just history, not just the outside world, but memory itself. Isaiah called it the cleansing of recollection, a sacred rite that began at age 5 and never truly ended. Every morning, before chores, before food, before even the morning prayer, each child was required to enter the hall of dust, a small room, windowless, airless, lit only by one dim lantern swinging from a rope in the center. A table, covered in smooth black stones, 26 stones, each one marked with a letter, each one tied to a memory the child was supposed to erase. A for anger, B for brother, C for city, D for dream, E for escape. And on, the child would close their eyes and reach out. And whatever letter they touched first, they would speak it aloud, then recite the memory associated with it, then burn it. Not metaphorically, each stone sat above a small tray of ashes, and beneath each tray, a wick soaked in oil. Once the memory was confessed, a match was lit, and the flame would rise, consuming the past, over and over, every day, until they stopped remembering anything at all. Mothers watched, fathers helped, even siblings encouraged one another, because in New Eden to remember was to sin. Isaiah said, "Memory is the root of rebellion, and forgetting is the only path to truth." But the truth wasn't peace. It was obedience. And slowly, you could see it in their eyes. A dimness, a dullness. The light of curiosity, snuffed out by repetition. One former member, now in her 40s, still wakes up at 5 a.m. each morning, still reaches for a stone that isn't there, still whispers, "I don't remember," even though she escaped decades ago, even though the stones were just symbols. The ritual wasn't about forgetting events. It was about forgetting yourself, because if you don't remember who you are, you'll believe anyone who tells you who to be. Once the past was gone, the prophet became the present and the future. Every voice you heard, every word you spoke, every thought you believed, began and ended with him. This was called the binding. It started small. A phrase added to every conversation, a reminder slipped into every prayer. Through the prophet, we are made whole. Through the prophet, we are made pure. At first, it felt like gratitude, like loyalty. But then it became law. No one was allowed to speak in public without beginning with the prophet's name, not greetings, not blessings, not even warnings. The prophet says the water is safe. The prophet says the harvest will be good. The prophet says you will be healed. Day by day, your own thoughts became his. You stopped saying I think. You stopped saying I believe. You stopped saying I will, because there was no I left. Even the children learned quickly. One boy was heard saying, I'm hungry. Joshua corrected him instantly. You are not hungry. The prophet is preparing you. And the boy repeated it, nodding, believing it, because to doubt meant danger, and to doubt out loud meant disappearance. Every wall in New Eden was marked with spirals of text, written in the prophet's own hand, phrases designed to loop endlessly in the mind. The will is the way is the will. The way does not end. You would see them when you woke, when you worked, when you slept, until the words stopped being words. They became rhythm. They became breath. And once that happened, you could no longer tell where your thoughts ended and his began. One woman, years after escaping, said she still hears his voice when she is alone. Not in dreams, not in memories, in her own thoughts. She doesn't know which ideas are hers anymore. She doesn't know if she ever will. That's what the binding did. It didn't make you love the prophet. It made you impossible to separate from him. And once that happened, you weren't just a follower, you were a part of him. They called it the trial of echoes. You were taken alone, blindfolded, led into a hollow barn built deep into the hillside, where even the wind refused to follow. The floor was dirt, cold, packed tight. Above you, hanging from the rafters, were rows of empty cages, each one once used for chickens, but there were no animals here, only sound. The trial began when the prophet's voice echoed through the chamber, but he was nowhere to be seen. His words came from all sides, distorted, twisted, layered, as if 1,000 versions of him were speaking at once, and your task was simple: speak the correct response to every sentence, no hesitation, no pause, no thought, only perfect obedience. You were expected to answer before the sentence even ended, to know his will so deeply, so instinctively that your voice echoed with his. If you failed, the lights would go out. If you hesitated, you would be left in silence, for hours, sometimes days. Some broke in less than 20 minutes, others never returned at all. What the prophet wanted was not just agreement, he wanted resonance. He wanted to know that when he spoke, you didn't just understand him, you became him. And so, the trial grew crueler, longer, more disorienting. The sentences became impossible. The prophet says you were never born. The prophet says your mother never lived. The prophet says you are already dead, and still you had to respond, not with fear, not with confusion, but with faith. A man named Carl Henders was once brought into the trial and made to kneel for 12 hours straight, blindfolded, starving. When they removed the blindfold, he was smiling, not with joy, but with absolute surrender. He said, "The prophet and I are one. I have no name." After that, he was allowed to marry, given a house, given children, but when those children vanished 3 years later, Carl said nothing, because those who passed the trial no longer questioned anything, not even the loss of their own blood, not even the silence that followed. Her name was Eliza Ward. She was 17, quiet, gentle, raised beneath the prophet's shadow since birth. She had passed the binding, survived the trial, and had been promised to one of Isaiah's inner circle. But on the 3rd morning of winter, Eliza whispered a question to her reflection, not to anyone else, not to a crowd, just to herself. And yet it shattered everything. She asked, "What if he's wrong?" 7 words, barely spoken, but in New Eden, doubt had gravity. It pulled everything toward it. It echoed. By dusk, 3 other girls had been taken from their homes, one for asking if Eliza was okay, one for frowning when she heard, and one who said nothing at all, but had shared her bread with Eliza the day before. Guilt in New Eden was a disease. It spread by association. That night, Eliza was taken to the white cell, a room no one ever returned from, square, featureless, windowless, where the prophet himself would visit in silence. No prayers, no lectures, just hours of stillness as his eyes stayed locked on yours, and your soul began to rot. But Eliza didn't break. Not in the first hour, not in the second, not when the lights dimmed, not when the air grew thin. She stared back, and for the first time in the prophet's reign, someone saw him. Not as a vessel, not as a god, but as a man. That terrified him, because belief can be controlled, fear can be managed, but recognition, true recognition, that's dangerous. So Eliza wasn't executed. She was erased. Every mention of her was destroyed. Every family who knew her was questioned. Every photo burned. Every diary ripped apart. She became a ghost that no one was allowed to remember. A name that could only be whispered in dreams. But she left something behind, before they took her. She carved 3 words into the underside of her bedpost, words that would one day lead to the unraveling of everything. He is lying. And though no one dared speak it, the people of New Eden began to feel it. Deep inside, a splinter of doubt, slowly turning. The next Sunday, the prophet called it a cleansing. The entire community was summoned to the hollow grounds, the open earth pit carved at the center of New Eden, surrounded by stone pillars, each etched with a name, a verse, a punishment. Children were made to kneel in rows, eyes closed, hands clasped, as drums beat slow and low, like the heartbeat of the town itself. Then one by one, the prophet began to speak their names. Not of the children, but of the families, the Warrens, the Brocks, the Keens, families that had been loyal, quiet, productive. Families who had done everything right. And yet each name was followed by a sentence: failure to believe beyond words, failure to surrender completely, failure to hear the prophet in silence. It was doctrine now, weaponized, and one by one these families were dragged forward, their children separated, mothers and fathers sent behind the eastern curtain, where no one ever returned. One mother, June Brock, tried to resist. She clung to her son's coat, screamed that they had done nothing wrong, begged for the prophet's mercy. But mercy had long been buried in New Eden. The guards struck her down, and her son, just 7 years old, was taken to the quiet house, where boys were made into believers or broken into silence. That was the cleansing, not of sin, but of hesitation, not of rebellion, but of thought, because the prophet knew what was coming. He had felt it the night Eliza looked into him, unblinking, unafraid. He had seen the future, and the only way to stop it was to remind the people that fear is stronger than memory, that loyalty must be louder than blood, and that silence, true silence, is born from terror. But in his panic, he made a mistake. He let too many witness the cruelty. Too many who once trusted now began to question, and doubt, as you already know, spreads like fire beneath a frozen field. It started with a letter, folded 5 times, slipped beneath the chapel door, written in blue ink, the kind the children weren't supposed to have. It said, "We know what you did to Eliza, and we are not afraid. No name, no signature, no threat, just the truth and the absence of fear." The prophet read it aloud at morning prayer, holding the letter like it was poison. Then he tore it in half and declared the enemy had returned, the outsiders, the wolves, the deceivers from the old world. He told them they had to tighten the circle, close the gates, cleanse their thoughts, burn their own diaries, and destroy every private item they owned, because secrets breed rot, and rot brings collapse. But it was too late. The silence had already cracked. That letter wasn't the only one. Dozens began to appear, slipped into kitchens, stuffed in coat sleeves, tucked behind prayer books. Some were short, others were pages long, stories of what the prophet had done, what the guards had seen, what the rituals truly were, and the most chilling part, they weren't written in adult hands, but by children, children raised in silence, in obedience, in prayer. Now asking questions, now writing truth, now passing it on in New Eden, that was rebellion. So the prophet ordered what he called the recollection. Each child was to be questioned, alone for hours, until their hands bled from copying scripture, until their minds forgot what they knew. But one boy, Samuel Wren, 11 years old, didn't break. When they asked if he had written the letter, he said no. When they asked if he knew who had, he said yes. And then he looked the guard in the eye and said, "It was all of us." That night, Samuel disappeared. But the next morning, a new message appeared, painted in red on the chapel wall. "You can't erase us all." And from that moment forward, the prophet understood something he had never feared before. The children were awake, and no prison is stronger than a child who stops believing. They called themselves the Remembered. They didn't wear symbols, didn't form lines, didn't speak of it aloud, but they knew each other, by the way they moved through the chapel, by the way they skipped a word in the prophet's prayer, or paused one beat longer than allowed before kneeling. That's how they signaled, without sound, without suspicion. They passed notes on dried leaves, buried messages beneath the roots of the orchard trees, wrote warnings in the ash left behind after chapel fire. This was their resistance, their revolution. One that didn't need fire. Not yet. Samuel Wren's name became a kind of sacred word, whispered in dreams, scratched into the undersides of pews, pressed into the dirt beside the hollow grounds. He had vanished, but he had lit the match. The older ones led the movement. Eliza's younger brother Jacob, only 13, but already more dangerous than any adult in the town. He had seen the prophet's eyes when Eliza defied him. He remembered the way the guards dragged her away, the blood on the floor, the silence afterward. He didn't want revenge, he wanted exposure. So Jacob made a plan, a dangerous one that would require the children to betray everything they'd ever been taught. Because behind the prophet's house, behind the altar, behind the quiet house, was a cellar, locked with 3 steel chains, guarded day and night, and no one ever returned from it. Jacob was going to open it, not to escape, but to reveal, because the truth, whatever it was, had to be buried there. And if they could show the others, the doubters, the fearful, what was really inside that cellar, then the prophet's power wouldn't matter anymore. Truth would be louder than fear, memory sharper than doctrine. So on the night of the full moon, as the prophet began his midnight sermon, and the guard's eyes turned toward the altar, 4 children slipped into the orchard, moved through the roots, into the V-ness, and reached the chains, and what they found there, behind that iron door, was not salvation, was not punishment, but proof. Proof of what had been done, and why no family ever left New Eden alive. It wasn't supposed to be warm, but when they cracked open the cellar door, a rush of heat hit their faces. Not fire, not breath, but something that had been buried too long and had begun to ferment. The chains had been cut with wire saws, passed down by a former caretaker's son. The key had been hidden in the mouth of a hollowed-out Bible. None of them expected what lay beneath. It was not a dungeon, not a vault, but a corridor lined with stone walls, painted white, and beneath the paint, scratches, handwritten names, dates, some as far back as 1952, children's names, dozens of them, erased from all records. But remembered here, on the walls, they walked in silence, bare feet on wet stone, the air getting thicker with every step, until they reached the room. It wasn't large, but the walls were lined with drawers, the kind you see in morgues, each one marked with a number. No names, no explanation, just a clipboard hanging near the door, with 82 rows, every row marked deceased, every column labeled family eliminated. They hadn't just vanished. They'd been recorded, filed, catalogued like inventory. Jacob opened the top drawer. Inside was a small figure, wrapped in linen, no smell, just silence, and a tag around the wrist. Age 9. Subject confessed. Result: successful purification. The others began opening drawers, one by one, and none were empty. This wasn't a punishment room. This was where belief led, where obedience ended, not in heaven, not in light, but in cold drawers under a church. Some of the children began to cry. One vomited, another simply sat on the floor and closed her eyes. But Jacob stood still, not out of shock, but clarity. Now they had proof. This was no longer myth, no longer whispered rumor. This was documentation, an archive of annihilation. When they emerged from the cellar, covered in sweat and dust, they didn't run, they didn't scream. They looked at the prophet, still preaching under candlelight, still smiling. And they understood. He didn't care that they knew, because he believed no one would ever listen to them, but he was wrong, because the remembered weren't going to stay quiet, not anymore. The prophet stood at the pulpit, arms raised, voice echoing off the beams of the chapel ceiling. He didn't see them at first. The 4 children, dirty, shaking, staring at him with something that looked like pity, but wasn't. It was resolve. Jacob didn't speak. He walked right up to the altar and dropped something onto the prophet's open Bible, a linen-wrapped tag, still damp, still marked. The prophet froze, not from fear, but from calculation. Behind Jacob, the others followed, dropping photographs, pages torn from the clipboard, a drawer's metal plate, bent, stained. The congregation didn't understand. Not yet, but Mrs. Caldwell did. She was the oldest woman in the community, blind in one eye, first to move into New Eden, back when it was just an idea, a promise whispered in a dying America. She stepped forward, knees cracking, hands trembling, and took the linen tag in her hands. She read the number, then gasped, dropped it. Her granddaughter's name, Eliza, had never been erased from her heart. That number, that wristband, was hers. The prophet tried to speak, but his voice caught. For the first time, in 30 years, he faltered. The children said nothing. They didn't need to. The congregation erupted, not in screams, but in motion. They rose like a wave, not angry, not yet, but shaken. Murmurs turned to questions. Questions turned to doubt, and that was all it took, because New Eden had always been fragile. A cult built on illusion, on silence, on never asking what was behind the cellar door. Now it had been opened, and they couldn't unsee it. Mrs. Caldwell took Jacob's hand, looked at the prophet, and said one word, liar. It echoed, carried, broke something in the room. Not just belief, but fear. And when the prophet ordered the guards to seize them, the guards hesitated. One stepped back. Another looked away. Because even they had started to wonder, what else was beneath their feet? What else had been filed, labeled, scientist purified? The children had done what no adult could. They had cracked the foundation, and now the storm would follow. The chapel was no longer quiet, no longer sacred, no longer safe. It was breaking, not with fire, not with blood, but with noise. People shouting, crying, demanding answers from ghosts in human skin. The prophet stepped down from the altar, his hands no longer raised in grace, but curled, tight, as if trying to hold something together that was already gone. He ordered the bell to be rung, the one that had only been tolled 3 times in 50 years, once when the first family vanished, once when the drought came, and once when the ark was sealed. Now it rang again, and with it came the sound of locks sliding into place. The gates of New Eden were closing. No one in, no one out. Panic swelled. Jacob saw it before the others. The movements, the quiet radioing between men in plain black jackets, the Prophet's final line of defense. They were going to contain the truth. One last time, by force, but someone unexpected stood up. Mr. Ames, a man who'd never spoken above a whisper in his life, head of maintenance, former veteran, quiet drinker, quiet watcher. He stepped in front of the children and said 3 words. They found it, just that, not a speech, not a sermon, but an admission. Then he looked at the Prophet and said, "Tell them about the Red Archive." The Prophet's face changed. He hadn't expected that name to surface. Not from a janitor. Not from someone so low in the hierarchy. The crowd hushed. Even the guards paused. The Prophet denied it. But Mr. Ames laughed, pulled a crumpled photograph from his pocket, held it high. It showed a concrete vault, a door with a red mark, a room sealed in 1974. Only 3 had keys, and one of them was him. Behind that door, he said, is everything. All of it, the experiments, the doctrines, the names of who gave the orders and where the children were sent before they disappeared forever. He pointed toward the woods, beyond the chapel, past the garden, to a small structure of turf. As grown, forgotten, and the crowd began to turn away from the Prophet toward the forest, toward the truth, because the cellar was just the beginning. The Red Archive was the reason New Eden existed, and they were going to open it even if it killed them. The path to the archive was narrow, twisting through bramble and thorn, a corridor of rot and memory. It had once been lined with torches. Now it was lit only by the glow of trembling cell phones, shaking in the hands of people who had never asked questions. Until now, Jacob walked first, Mr. Ames behind him. The rest followed like shadows torn loose. The Prophet did not follow. He stayed behind, at the chapel, muttering something that sounded like scripture, but felt more like a curse. The Red Archive stood buried beneath a tool shed, disguised for decades, forgotten by everyone except those who were forbidden to forget. A steel hatch, sealed with a rusted padlock, and beneath that, a biometric scanner, dead for years, until Mr. Ames held up a severed cable and said, "Battery's still good." With a spark and a hum, the lock disengaged, the door groaned open, and the smell hit them. Old bleach, wet stone, and something else, something that clung to your lungs like mold. They descended, 7 steps, then 14, then 21, each marked with a number burned into the concrete, like a countdown. At the bottom, they found the vault, and on it, painted in fading red letters, 2 words. Do not. Jacob reached forward and turned the wheel. It resisted, creaked, then gave way. Inside, the room was colder than death. Shelves lined the walls. Crates, binders, tape reels, jars. One jar, still sealed, contained a strip of human skin, tattooed with a number matching the bracelet Eliza Caldwell once wore. They spread out, opening boxes, unsealing history. They found photographs of children arranged in rows, eyes wide, faces blank. They found letters signed by elders, approving behavioral resets. They found film footage marked 1976 purity trials. But the worst came last. A book, hand-bound, leather cover, no title. Inside, meticulously handwritten notes from the Prophet himself and the men who came before him. Description of sessions, of trials, of failed attempts to create God's conduits. Children weren't taken. They were offered. They were prepared. The sermons were lies. The rituals were conditioning. And the worst part, the Prophet wasn't the first. He was just the latest vessel. In a chain that had begun long before New Eden ever broke ground, Jacob read the final page. It didn't say Amen. It said, "If they ever find this, we were wrong about the fire." It didn't purify them. It awakened something else. He looked at the others. No one spoke, because they had just opened the door. But something else, might already be walking through it. They thought the archive was the end. They were wrong, because as they climbed the steps back into the air, the earth was already shifting. The chapel bell rang by itself. 3 slow tolls, then a 4th, something it had never done. The sky darkened, but there were no clouds, just stillness, dead stillness, no birds, no wind, just the sound of their boots on brittle leaves, and the distant echo of something groaning beneath the surface. Jacob's phone buzzed. No service, then flickered, then displayed a single word, rooted. He turned to Mr. Ames, but the old man was pale, sweating. He said, "It's starting again, isn't it?" No one answered. Back at the chapel, the prophet was gone. The pews were empty, the altar stripped. But behind the pulpit, a new passage had opened, cracked stone, leading downward, a place no one had seen before. Or maybe they'd just been made to forget. They moved in silence, deeper than the archive, deeper than the foundation. What they entered wasn't a basement. It was a root system, vast, organic, grown not from trees but from ritual. Pillars of hardened ash, tunnels supported by fused bone, and walls marked with the same spiral symbol that had been carved into the children's hands decades ago. The deeper they went, the more the lights dimmed, not from lack of power, but something thicker, heavier. Reality was thinning. And then they reached it, a chamber, round, perfect, lined with statues of the founders, all eyeless, all facing inward. And in the center, a pit, not a well, not a grave, but a living wound in the earth, breathing slowly, exhaling air that smelled like burnt honey and old prayer books. Jacob leaned over the edge, and he saw something moving, not fast, not violent, but aware. It turned and looked at him, and in his head, a voice that wasn't a voice said, "You finally came home." He staggered back, eyes wide, mouth open, but no words came, because it wasn't speaking to him. It was speaking to all of them, everyone who had been born here, raised here, buried something here. New Eden was not a town. It was a seed, planted in flesh, watered with obedience, and now it was beginning to sprout. They thought it was a town, a failed community, a lost experiment in faith. But New Eden had never been a place. It had always been a body, and now it was waking up. The day after the archive opened, the first person vanished. Her name was Ruth Harding, 78 years old, hadn't left her house in 6 years. They found her porch light still on, dinner half eaten. But no trace of Ruth, no forced entry, no prints. Just the faintest mark on the wall, a spiral, drawn in condensation, still dripping when the deputy arrived. That was the beginning. By nightfall, 5 more were gone. No one heard screams. No one saw struggle. One man stepped into his closet, never stepped out. Another leaned over to tie his shoes and never came back up. And every time, the spiral was left behind, not painted, not carved, formed from the distortion of the space itself, like the wall had turned to breath, then settled again. The town panicked. Families packed. Cars roared down the gravel roads. But no one left, because the road no longer ended at the highway. It looped, brought them right back, to the welcome sign. Even if they drove in the opposite direction, Jacob stood in the center of town, watching headlights circle like ghosts, while the chapel bell tolled 13 times and never stopped. They tried fire, tried salt, tried prayer. None of it mattered, because the town wasn't haunted. It was possessed by memory. The spiral wasn't a symbol. It was a command, and the town was obeying. Eliza's voice returned first from the walls of the old schoolhouse, soft, like a lullaby underwater. She spoke to her mother, to her brother, and finally to Jacob. She said, "You found the root, but you forgot the fruit." And then, we never left. We were grown. And just like that, the walls of the schoolhouse peeled back, not collapsed, unfolded, revealing rows of empty desks, and behind each one, a small, withered handprint, burned into the wood. They weren't gone. They were fused into the town itself. Every house, every floorboard, every wall. New Eden didn't bury its secrets. It became them. And now, it was hungry. By morning, no voices remained in the air, only silence thick enough to choke. The chapel had collapsed into itself. Not burned, not broken, inverted, as if sucked downward by something older than gravity. The schoolhouse was gone, just ash floating in a perfect spiral that never touched the ground, and Jacob stood alone, not because he survived, but because he had always been part of it. The others weren't missing. They were inside him, their memories, their fears, their silence. They whispered through his blood, sang in his teeth, dragged their fingernails along the inside of his skull. He didn't cry, he didn't scream, because even his voice now belonged to the town. He walked back to the well, the place that wasn't a well, where the root had first breathed. It was wider now, hungrier. He stepped to the edge, looked down, and what he saw was not death. It was structure, stone and bone, wood and blood, all formed into a spiral staircase, descending forever, not built by hand, but grown by obedience, layer by layer, from the faith of every family that came here. This was never about religion or farming or utopia. It was about containment. New Eden wasn't meant to thrive. It was meant to hold something in. And every child born here, every hymn sung, every sermon preached, was a nail in the coffin of a God too old to name. But the nails were rusted now, and the God was stirring. Jacob stepped onto the first stair, not because he wanted to, but because there was no other choice. The spiral pulls, that's what it was always meant to do, not a symbol, a map, leading inward and downward, and back to the moment before time remembered how to protect itself. As he descended, the town folded behind him. Houses collapsed, roads unraveled, trees bent inward like ribs. And then, New Eden was gone. No ruins, no smoke, just a field of tall grass swaying gently, under a sky with no stars, and if you stand there long enough, you'll feel it. A breath from beneath your feet, not wind, not earth, but memory, trying to climb back up, and if you listen closely, you'll hear the last words ever spoken in New Eden, whispered not by voice, but by the dirt itself. Obedience returns to root. And now, you know why. Every family that moved to New Eden disappeared.